Let's see. Elizabeth asks uh, if I could comment on Reagan's relationship with Thatcher and the influence of that relationship on American foreign policy. Great question, Elizabeth. So Thatcher was probably the foreign leader who Reagan felt most identified with. Both he and Thatcher saw themselves as kind of conservative outsiders who had come in the US and Britain to replace long years of more liberal, progressive leadership. They both took on unions. They both thought government had gotten too big. And they also both believed in taking a strong stance against communism. Margaret Thatcher's father had been involved in union activities and been very upset about communist activities in Britain in earlier decades. And so she had sort of taken that. And Thatcher influenced Reagan in two ways, Elizabeth. One, I think I mentioned already, she met Gorbachev before Reagan did, and noticed, she was very, very astute observer, that Gorbachev was different from all the other Soviet stooges she had met. And she signaled that and really prepared Reagan for Gorbachev to be different. Second, even though she often was a little concerned about Reagan getting too friendly with Gorbachev, she had a relationship with Reagan. She trusted Reagan. And so she was willing to support Reagan's reaching out to Gorbachev, I think, in a way she wouldn't herself. And so they were partners. And it really wasn't just about Reagan going out on his own. And I think that made a big difference as well. I think he might not have been as confident reaching out to Gorbachev without her support and without her initial encouragement of him to do that. Beth Hook asks, was Gorbachev open to allowing Eastern Europe to having their own independence? He was. His vision was that actually Eastern Europe should have more independence because the East European regimes, East Germany in particular, but also Poland and Hungary and Czechoslovakia, they were drains on the Soviet economy. Soviet Union was expending money on those societies. He wanted to bring that money in for reform at home so he could improve agriculture, so he could improve technology. The Soviet Union had trouble getting computers to people. They had trouble copying computers from the West. They felt very much behind. He wanted to bring resources in to build his own kind of Silicon Valley. He asked George Shultz about that many times, Shultz being the Secretary of State from California. So in some ways, Gorbachev wanted to get rid of these other countries. And he certainly did not want to use force. He wanted to get away from the expensive use of force and focus on building what he thought was real communism in the Soviet Union. In the process of doing that, he allowed enough freedom for people to actually revolt against the system, which is what happened. Okay, so Beth is asking another great question. With what is going on now, why don't the Russian people revolt more rather than just risk their lives with protest? If the oligarchs are being held to the same level of sanctions, don't they understand they will lose as well? I think that's true. Did it hurt Reagan's appeal? Okay, she asked about Nancy then as well. So Beth's question is fantastic, right? Why don't the Russians revolt more? And part of it is just fear. It's a terrible society of fear right now. In fact, I'm amazed at how courageous some people have been to protest the invasion of Ukraine. It shows an extraordinary amount of courage on their part. But people will become less fearful when they know there are more people out there like them, and when they come to believe and see that the police forces won't always follow Putin's lead. That's why it really is important what the military leaders and the oligarchs decide. I think the oligarchs are already uncomfortable with what Putin's doing because the sanctions now have reached a level where they are, in very, very short time, going to start limiting the oligarchs' wealth in ways the oligarchs don't want. These rich men want their wealth to be limited. They don't want it limited that way. So I think they're going to be putting pressure, but this takes time. And fear, it takes a long time to lose fear. And Putin, like other dictators, is pretty good at using fear at home and propaganda. Did Nancy Reagan's use of a psychic and tarot cards, she used them to dictate the times Reagan had meetings sometimes and things like that. Did that hurt Reagan? It did in some people's eyes, but it helped him in other people's eyes. It depends on your point of view. Many saw he and Nancy as having a kind of a wonderful relationship. They did. And that was appealing to many people. On the other hand, Nancy's eccentricities turned a lot of people off. So to this day, when you talk to people who lived through that period, they either loved Nancy or hated her. I've often thought, it's interesting. She's so different from Hillary Clinton. But like Hillary Clinton, she was a lightning rod. There are very few people who had no position on her because, like Hillary Clinton, she was an active person. She wasn't like Barbara Bush, who, of course, also had influence on George, but didn't publicly show that. Nancy was not an intellectual in the way that Hillary was, but she was actively involved in her husband and the president's thinking and his scheduling and various things. There were a number of interviews where he's asked a question and she also answers. And there are a lot of people who, men and women, who are not comfortable with a powerful woman next to the president. And they develop very strong opinions. So I think Nancy helped him with some audiences, hurt him with others. Sandra asks, "Is that podcast you play tonight? Do you feel it's high school students?" Yes. Thank you, Sandra, for asking that question. Our weekly podcast, This Is Democracy, is aimed at young listeners. My son is on there. He's the co-host. He's 17 years old. He begins every episode with a poem, and then we talk to experts. But the idea is to provide a historical explanation that's accessible for young people today, and it's used, the podcast, in a number of high school classes that I know of. The episode on Ukraine, the one I put in the chat. We talked to Michael Kimmich, who's an expert on Ukraine and Russia, but we talked to him not about the details and technical stuff, but about first understanding the background to this invasion. What happened before? Why did this invasion occur? What effect is it having? And how should we be thinking about it as Americans? And so it's aimed exactly at that age level. And the podcast is not about policy. It's really about understanding, using history to understand the world that we're in. That's what I believe in. And thanks for asking about that, Sandra. Pam, do you think the average Russian is getting the true story of what Putin is doing? No. Putin uses propaganda at home. He's, of course, used propaganda in our society. You cannot call the Russian invasion of Ukraine an invasion on Facebook. They've limited that. But Russians also have a long experience distrusting and getting around false information. So they don't know the full story, but they don't trust Putin either. They know not to believe the official narrative. We're often a little more naive about that, actually, I think. We like to believe the narrative of our party. If you're a Democrat, you believe the Democratic narrative. If you're a Republican, you believe the Republican narrative. Russians are much more cynical about that. Beth asks, how are the youth of Russia obtaining their information of what is happening in Ukraine? Just a great follow-on to that. Many of them have family overseas, and you can still talk to people. You can still text. You have to be careful what you say, but you can still do that. And they also know how to get around a lot of the censorship. Young people are usually smarter than people in their 40s like me in figuring out how to get around things. And so they use all kinds of methods. And by the way, many Russian families, especially Russian urban families, have relatives in Ukraine. This is a real problem for Russia. Many of those soldiers who are moving in there, they are being asked to fire upon their family members or the communities their family members live in, which is a real problem. And Sandra says, yeah, I've heard this too. I don't use TikTok, but I've heard that there's a lot of information being transferred by TikTok, certainly by Twitter. Okay, and then Beth asks, and maybe we'll use this as the last question before we get to the document. How did the Russians, Gorbachev, view Reagan and Americans in general during the 80s? Great question. It's hard to generalize, but Russians did have somewhat caricatured views of the U.S. They did have this view of a country run by fat, rich, big fat cats, partially true, but over-exaggerated. They had read a lot about racism in the United States, so they knew about that, and there's a reality of that, but they had an exaggerated or caricatured view of that. But they also had a sense of the United States as a place that was so much more prosperous. And I think that was the prosperity that really gets them. Russians understood that Americans had so much stuff they didn't. And they saw the inferiority of their society relative to ours in that way. And so one of the allures of not just the United States, but going to West Germany was that you could buy blue jeans, which were almost unaffordable in Russia. You could eat food that actually tasted good. You could go to restaurants. And so it was the prosperity of the United States, I think, that was often one of the most attractive things. Yes, they believed in freedom, but freedom is a general term that can come to mean anything for anyone. I think it was the choices that we had and the prosperity we had that really was most alluring to people in Russia looking out toward the West.